All right, it's 4 o'clock, 4:01 even, so we're going to start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dennis Broeders. I'm professor of global security and technology at Leiden University and senior fellow of the Hague program on international cybersecurity. Welcome to our monthly seminar series, which has sort of evolved into a seminar series where we mainly ask people who have just put out a book that caught our eye and that we're interested in to come present about the book, state their case, and then have a discussion with who is here. The big brain behind this series is Monica Kaminska, who is now gone to black, but she's the one who organizes it, but I will chair it today. Our guest today is Lucas Kello. Lucas is Associate Professor of International Relations at Oxford University and co-director of the Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity. He's definitely not a novice to the field. He is author of The Virtual Weapon and International Order, published by Yale University Press, which has been doing the rounds. He is one of the few people in my estimation that does a serious effort of trying to translate IR theory into this new domain that we're all interested in. And he's out with a brand new book called Striking Back: The End of Peace in Cyberspace and How to Restore It. And we were talking just before everybody entered about the trajectory towards that. And I'm proud to say that the Hague program has been a stop along that way, perhaps even at the early beginning of it, when Lucas did a keynote speech for us at our annual conference, which, by the way, is in 2 weeks again. So how this usually works is we give the floor to the speaker, so to Lucas. He speaks for about 30, 40 minutes, depending on how we time it out, and then we open the floor for debate. Don't be shy. It's an interesting space. We've had lots of animated debates and good questions, so I'm hoping today will not be different. With that, I give the floor to Lucas and look forward to the speech as well as the debate. Lucas, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis, for that generous introduction. It's great to be back here in the Hague Programs Forum to discuss these topics, which I indeed, some of them, began to think very seriously about in the context of the conference that I spoke at a few years ago. So it's great to be back, and thank you all for joining. So the book, Striking Back, examines the intensifying geopolitical conflict in cyberspace and how we arrived at the current situation, what we can do about it, and I think equally importantly, what we should not do about it. And my main motivation in writing it is simply the growing instability and risks in cyberspace. This is a problem that I have long been thinking and writing about, indeed, well before the conference attendance with the Hague program. And yes, it's true that we haven't yet witnessed a true active cyber war. Nevertheless, the number and severity of offensive cyber activity below the war line, targeting Western and democratic nations, has grown steadily over the last 15 years. We've seen impairment of economic infrastructures, disruption of financial systems, sustained theft of military and industrial secrets, wholesale infiltration of government agencies, the fanning of political division in election and other contexts, and so forth. And Western leaders have reacted to this intensifying activity by decrying it and by promising, in many instances, stern responses in order to prevent further ordeals. Yet the responses so far have been too weak and I think largely ineffective in persuading the other side to back off. Much more can and should be done, I argue in the book, to strengthen deterrence, including by shoring up the resilience and redundancy of vital systems and data with technological innovations. So the challenge then isn't only how to respond to cyber attacks more credibly, although that's a central piece of the puzzle. It's also about how to implement new measures to improve adversary denial. So the book's central message draws from a lesson of history, which is that if you look at previous technological revolutions, we can observe that security contests in the midst of technological disruption and geopolitical transition, as in our current time, are won with superior strategy, not with better technology. And for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, an era when Britain harnessed the power of the steam engine and factories to achieve global hegemony, Russia's resurgence and China's rise atop the international hierarchy coincide with rapid technological disruption. So it's not just the distribution of power that's changing in the international system. It's also the very nature of power that is evolving. This observation brings me to 4 key arguments in the book that I'll summarize for the audience here. The first concerns the changing tides of modern conflict. The relevance of war in security competitions among large nations has diminished. Of course, war remains a central phenomenon in international affairs, as illustrated by Russia's land grabs in Georgia in 2008, in Crimea in 2014, and more broadly, of course, and tragically, in Ukraine this year. But war, so far, remains absent in the direct dealings among large nations. I think, if anything, the tragedy of war in Ukraine is a reminder of just how ruinous politically and economically a direct war, not to say a nuclear war, between Russia and NATO or between China and the United States would be. Such an epical war could break out accidentally or even intentionally if, for example, Vladimir Putin perceived that his regime was at risk of imminent collapse. And we have to bear that in mind. So mine isn't certainly not an argument about the obsolescence of war, but rather about the expansion of lesser forms of conflict at the heart of geopolitical competitions. The main contenders pursue their quarrels mainly, and I think increasingly, within the middle of the spectrum between war and peace that I labeled in my last book, The Virtual Weapon, Unpeace. Over the last decade and a half, we've seen a series of major cyber events, none of whose effects individually, I think, have convincingly met the legal threshold of a use of force or armed attack, because their effects were not overtly violent or fatal. But their cumulative political, economic, and social effects have been too damaging to be dismissed or treated as peacetime competition. So this is one of the central conceptual points of the book. We often hear correctly about the absence of war in cyberspace, but we should also emphasize the loss of peace. We live in a time of intense technological rivalry that increasingly threatens the legitimacy of democratic elections and the integrity of economic infrastructures. In our current era, less direct war among large powers, indeed no direct war among large powers so far, has not meant more peace. Indeed, as security analysts, we should no longer think of the absence of war as the prevalence of peace. The consequence of cyberspace is that it's possible, and I think increasingly likely, that we will be locked in a struggle that is neither warlike nor peaceful. Second major argument of the book concerns the challenger states themselves, chiefly Russia and China. So Moscow and Beijing use cyberspace to challenge the liberal international order that Western and democratic nations currently dominate. They seek to avoid a direct military clash with the United States, Britain, and other large nations, while at the same time seeking new technological means of inflicting strategic pain short of war. In my current assessment, the risk of war at the periphery of relations among large powers, say between China and Taiwan or between the United States and Iran, has gone up and will continue to rise, while at the same time, the desire to avoid a direct military confrontation will remain strong. This has prompted Russia and China to look for alternative technological means of rivalry that spare the rising powers the serious repercussions of wars of territorial conquest and coercion, which Russia is learning, I think, all too well in the blunder of its invasion of Ukraine. The main thing that one has to understand about Russian cyber activity is that an activist foreign policy underpins it. So much like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Russia under Vladimir Putin has sought to export illiberal values, even to the point of trying to refashion other states, especially Western-leaning ones like Ukraine, within its near abroad, according to its own political image. Now, there's been an abiding controversy within the academic literature about the nature and objectives of Russia's foreign policy. One camp has believed that Russia seeks to alter the international order, but without fundamentally challenging it. In this view, Putin's government should be treated primarily as a security partner rather than as a security competitor. The hope in some Western capitals was that if only Russia could be embraced economically, if only we could expose the regime to the political customs and values of democracy, then the country could become a viable joint custodian of the international order rather than its main detractor. Much of Western and especially European policy towards Russia has shown the hallmarks of this confused and contradictory approach. So on the one hand, you have the castigation for repeated violations of international law and norms, including, of course, in cyberspace. And on the other, the notion that the transgressing regime is more a friend than an opponent has lived on. The brutal expansion of war in Ukraine, however, has, I think, decisively shattered that confusion. But the reality is that the wrongness of this approach was evident for anyone caring to see it, and indeed some of us did see it, since at least the 2007 cyber attacks against Estonia's computer systems, which occurred just 2 months after Putin's infamous speech decrying NATO and the West in Munich. Or if not then, I think then certainly it was evident during the invasion by Russia of Georgia the following year. The importance of cyberspace in Russia's revisionist foreign policy becomes apparent if we examine its underlying security doctrine. So in the early 1990s, Russian security thinking discarded the assumption, which was dominant in Soviet thinking, of conventional military superiority. Instead, it has emphasized what Russia's Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, in 2013 labeled nonlinear or next generation war. Now, despite the language of war, the doctrine's main methods are distinctly not warlike, and that indeed is its main appeal. A few years ago, two prominent military analysts wrote, and I'm quoting here, military capabilities are no longer any good for achieving relevant objectives. It's extraordinary, it seems to me, how much Russian strategists seem to have forgotten their own maxims in the Ukrainian blunder. But however much Putin extols military virtues, I don't think that the war in Ukraine signals a return to a doctrine of military primacy in Moscow. I mean, how could it when the Russian army seems to be faring so badly? If then, as Gerasimov and others instructed, an epical military clash with NATO was to be avoided almost at all costs, and I believe this remains a central assumption in Moscow, then it became necessary to prioritize the techniques of what I call technological unpeace, the social media influence campaigns, compromise operations to damage political opponents' reputations, disruption of infrastructures, and so on. So in my interpretation, as I discuss in the book, the driving aim of Russia's offensive cyber strategy isn't coercion, and it's certainly not territorial conquest. Rather, it's to reduce the effectiveness of Western policy by weakening its political and economic bases. In other words, the idea is that one can achieve at least some of the strategic gains in cyberspace while avoiding the serious repercussions of war and conquest or even coercion in real space. China, for its part, has pursued its own brand of revisionism in the international system. It's a particular style rooted in the country's perception of national greatness, which is anchored in a rich history of the Middle Kingdom, a vision that since Mao's time, of course, has manifested a communist ideological zeal. Now, I don't have time here to elaborate on this point, but let me just say that China no doubt, is observing the situation in Ukraine very closely and drawing lessons from it. Although China's military capacity is rapidly expanding, and while it does have a plausible case for military primacy if it wanted to pursue it, its leaders will almost certainly want to avoid the military catastrophes of a major war of displacement with the United States, which will increasingly lead Beijing to grapple with Washington in technological arenas rather than on the battlefield directly, which indeed has been the case so far. A third point in the book is perhaps the most important of all. It has to do with strategy. Western and democratic nations are losing the race to adapt security strategy to the new technological challenges. The Western approach to cyber conflict reduction, as I discussed here at the Hague program a few years ago, remains wedded to existing international law and norms. This is an approach that I call cyber legalism. Briefly, this is a view that seeks to prevent conflict by invoking the restraints of law and norms. The problem is that the existing legal system is not well suited to this task because it doesn't expressly limit nonviolent activity, however politically, socially, or economically harmful. It doesn't explicitly limit hostile maneuvers within other countries' information spaces. Now, despite the agreement, which was very much celebrated, I think, prematurely at the 2015 UNGGE round, that international law applies to cyberspace, there is in fact a fundamental disagreement among nations about how and where the law applies. The Western legalist view embraces the legal system because its adherents think that the law can be used to limit damaging actions falling short of war. The view of Russia and China, however, seems to be the opposite. For them, the international rulebook is relevant because of what it omits, namely the prohibitions against unpeaceful actions. But the problem is deeper because Western leaders seem not to have figured out, even for themselves, how to respond more decisively to actions that the rulebook, after all, doesn't expressly limit. So for all the talk about building global cyber norms, the normative enterprise remains fractured and rudimentary, and I think that that will be the case for a good while to come. So the result of these doctrinal challenges is decision and delay and paralysis in Western capitals. So what we can observe is that reactions from Western leaders, ranging from Obama and Biden to senior officials at NATO or in Europe, is that they don't tolerate acts of technological aggression. Indeed, Britain's head of MI6, just to give one example, described Russia's social media operations during the Brexit referendum as a violation of his country's sovereignty. Yet decision makers continuously struggle to carry out meaningful responses. And what we've mainly seen, and the book delves into these details, is the use of targeted criminal indictments and financial sanctions, which have evidently failed to dissuade foreign attackers significantly. What we haven't yet seen much of, with few exceptions like Obama's response to the Sony Pictures hack in 2014, is sterner measures such as macroeconomic sanctions or the linkage of cyber activity with other areas of diplomacy. Some of these areas are areas where we in the West hold distinct advantages. Now, this brings me to a fourth and final point about deterrence. It's failing significantly, but crucially, it can still be rescued, as I argue. And indeed, it must be rescued because however much we might want to build more restraining norms, other nations will continue to resist them. So if on this basis, law and norms are a source of the problem of conflict prevention rather than its solution, what do? Well, we have to focus on calculated deterrence. In other words, convincing the other side that the material costs of technological aggression are higher than its expected gains. The best way to restore stability and reduce conflict in cyberspace is not by invoking liberal ideals that other countries clearly reject, but rather by affecting their material interests. So to this end, the book elaborates on two mechanisms to improve deterrence, which I will review briefly and can elaborate upon in the Q&A. One is my strategy of punctuated deterrence, which I introduced in the virtual weapon and elaborate upon in Striking Back. So the main idea here is that decision makers have a higher chance of success in preventing cyber attacks by responding to a series of actions and their cumulative effects, rather than by doing what classical deterrence theory prescribes, which is to respond to single events. There are challenges in doing this, however, because we don't have robust traditions of thinking about spectral conflict. For example, democratic nations aren't accustomed to thinking about information security from a political perspective. That's been the concern so far, mainly of autocratic nations that have imposed stringent controls upon their domestic internets. Our challenge is different but urgent. We have to resolve the problem of regulating pernicious online content, especially in election settings, without violating basic freedoms of expression. This is a dilemma that autocrats don't have to face. Our societies have not yet developed clear benchmarks on how to strike that balance, or even from a foreign policy perspective on how to respond proportionately to foreign interventions. A second mechanism for conflict prevention that I discuss in the book involves adversary denial. So we often speak, I think rightly, about the general advantages that cyber attackers enjoy against defenders, but technological innovations can help to correct that imbalance. So among the most promising ideas, which the book examines in great detail, is the use of data embassies or foreign-based cloud servers to back up essential government systems. This is an initiative pioneered by the Estonian government in close collaboration with private companies such as Microsoft. The basic idea here is that by replicating a layer of government data and services running from computers abroad, you can thereby ensure the continuity of digital government in the midst of a breakdown in cyberspace, or even indeed in a foreign military occupation. Now, for nations such as Estonia that offer many citizen services online, ranging from voting and taxation to business and land registration, data embassies offer a means not just of digital continuity, but also state continuity. So the implications of the initiative of data embassies, I think, far transcend the realm of cybersecurity. Now, if correctly implemented and tested, these and other defensive innovations can bolster deterrence by reducing an aspiring attacker's expected gains from attack. Revitalizing cyber denial requires closer and more flexible partnerships between government and industry, which presents challenges of its own to business leaders. So companies, especially the large technology firms, will find themselves increasingly embroiled in geopolitical events. We saw a clear illustration of that growing trend in Russia's takedown of Viasat's internet provision in Ukraine. Now, I don't have the time here to elaborate on this important point, but here again, I think the Estonian Microsoft cooperation on data embassies offers valuable lessons and insights. So in closing, I want to emphasize that my main interest in writing this book was a concern about strengthening the strategic defense, because I think that the value system of democracies and their open information spaces dictate a mainly defensive cyber posture rather than an offensive one. But that posture requires major redevelopment. Although democratic nations have been winning the sprint to develop new technologies such as social media and AI, they're losing the marathon to adapt security strategy to new inventions. Now, against this troubling diagnosis, I want to end, Dennis, by offering the audience a note of optimism, which is that it's not too late for Western nations and their democratic partners to adapt their security thinking to technological threats. And that's why I called the book Striking Back rather than Letting Go. Thank you.